My guest today is Eric Wearne, Associate Professor at the Coles College of Business at Kennesaw State University in Georgia and Director of the National Hybrid Schools Project. He is also the author of the 2020 book, Defining Hybrid Homeschools in America, Little Platoons. Eric was previously on the podcast in the spring of 2022 ahead of his inaugural Hybrid Schools Conference. That event was such a huge success that Eric has expanded the conference each year to larger venues in Atlanta. And this year is also hosting the Western Hybrid and Microschools Forum in San Diego on March 2nd to showcase what's happening with hybrid and microschools on the West Coast. There's still time to register for that California conference, as well as the national conference happening again in Atlanta in April. I'll be presenting at both events and will include registration links in the show notes. So hope to see many of you there. Eric Wearne, thanks so much for coming back on the Liberated podcast.
Thanks. It's great to see you again, Carrie.
It's great to have you here. I am just so excited to see the popularity and growth of the Hybrid Schools Project, the conference, now the second conference on the West Coast this year. It just seems like increasing popularity and interest in hybrid schools, microschools, and alternative education more generally. So I'm thrilled to have you back to talk about what you've seen over the past few years and where you think we're going. But I'd love to be able to start with a little bit of your background. So you began researching hybrid schools, hybrid homeschools, and then I think really began to connect the dots with kind of microschools and sort of emerging learning models. But let's start with hybrid schools. What are they, and why did you become interested in reaching them back before alternative education became even more popular?
Yeah, so I've been involved with these kinds of schools since, 2011 or 2012. And the way I got involved in it is as a parent. So I have now 7 kids. I started with fewer than that, and the oldest 2 were in a perfectly good conventional public school, but we could see things weren't going kind of the way that we wanted to long term. And so my wife and I helped. We jumped in on an existing hybrid school, and we helped open the high school program there. So the first year we graduated 4 kids, and my daughter, who was in kindergarten and who made the jump with us, graduated last year with 40 of her good friends. So it grew a lot. And I had started as a parent, and I thought, this is kind of an interesting kind of thing. And when I would say to people, my kids go to school 2 days a week with teachers and classes and classmates and desks and things like that, and the rest of the week they're homeschooled. Back in 2012 and 13, and people would say, "Oh, that's really interesting," or they might say, "Well, yeah, I've heard of a school like that." So I've always been interested in school choice research, and no one in that time was writing very much about this. So I said, I think I'll do some writing about this, and it sort of snowballed from there. So I'm really glad to have started back then, because things really blew up after COVID. People got really interested in all these different kinds of things. And one of the things I found, and I'll stop after this, is you know people come up with really interesting ideas, and it's all kind of gray. They all kind of overlap a little bit, right? So when you talk about hybrid schools that meet part-time, we've also got micro schools that meet part-time. We've also got other interesting things that are of various sizes and curriculum flavors. So I think all of these kind of entrepreneurial, community started schools are kind of like, intersecting and working with each other and growing in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but let's stay on hybrid schools for a
Yeah.
moment, which, these have been around for a long time. I think there's obviously more interest in these alternative models, and hybrid homeschooling being one of those. But your research really traces the origins of hybrid homeschools to the early 1990s and the development of hybrid homeschool networks, national networks that now include dozens of hybrid homeschool programs. What have you seen in terms of the growth and interest specifically in hybrid homeschools from, say, before your book came out in
Yeah.
2020 and to, now? just in that particular model?
Yeah. So just in that model, some of the oldest ones are from the oldest ones that I found anyway are from 1990, something like this. And those are the university model network schools were kind of the oldest ones. Although there may be individual mom and pop ones that I haven't found that are that old. So if one of your listeners has one of those schools, I'd love to hear about it. Um, yeah, but so before COVID, I would say the vast majority of people involved in those schools had been at some point in their lives full-time homeschoolers, right? And that's kind of the cultural vibe that they had, was that they were full-time homeschoolers, and then they came over and had this sort of more formal version of a co-op in their hybrid school. Um, COVID changed that a lot in the sense that lots more people got interested, and they're coming from lots of different directions, right? So now instead of, 3/4 of your school consisting of people who had been full-time homeschoolers and now they're going to school a couple days a week, we have people coming from conventional public schools, from other private schools, right? The next best option now is not just, my public school or the expensive private school down the street. They're coming from all kinds of directions, right? And that's been an interesting change because you have different schools are answering kind of their demands in different ways, right? So the homeschoolers tend to be more independent, right? Like the issue you have sometimes is, all right, how do we keep everybody on pace? Because you have to have logistical like sanity if you're running a class of different kids. And you can't just say, well, we got busy today, so we're going to catch up, next week. It's harder when you have a class that's running together. Now you've got people who come from situations where they were in full-time, say, public school or private school, where every moment of their day was dictated. And now they're home a couple days a week. And that's like learning those self-regulation skills. And even the parents having to, like, by the nature of the school, be more involved with what's happening every day. That's just a different kind of thing. I think it's great because, and this is political science 101, right? You want to grow your constituency and get more people on your team. So I think it's awesome, but that's an interesting change, I think, as we get people who don't have a homeschooling background coming into this area.
Yeah, and one of the things that you write about in your book is that there's a lot of differentiation between these hybrid schools, even though you would define them the same. They, have full-time classwork, say 2 to 3 days a week, and the rest of the week that they're home. That the schools themselves often define themselves differently. So some will say that
Yep.
they are a group of private schoolers, others will say they're a group of homeschoolers. Some of that has to do, I imagine, with legality in certain locations, but some of it you found really is about individual identity of these programs. I wonder if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, you're right. Some of it is, we'll see two schools that look on the surface. If I just handed you their two schedules, they look the same, right? But one will say, no, we're a school. And the other will say, well, we're more of a group of homeschoolers. Yeah, part of it is state regulations, that are different state by state. Some of that evolved out of COVID too, in terms of, what you could do in particular states if you were a school versus not. Um, but a lot of it is what you're getting at is just a cultural thing, right? So is your school that meets, say you meet 2 days a week on the home days, are you giving parents super detailed lesson plans to work through? Are you checking in with them, with the teachers online at particular points on the home days or something like that? Or are you saying here, we're working on this subject at school. Parents just do something related to this subject on the home days, right? Or here's your packet of work. Just kind of get through it during the week as you have time, right? That's a leadership and a cultural decision, right? So what do you want out of your parents? And I think that's amazing that even with, we've already kind of maybe, I don't know if evolve is the right word, but I'll use it. Evolved from a 5-day school to this hybrid model where you're doing things a little bit differently. But even from there, we go and mutate. Mutate is another one I don't know if I like, but we'll use that one too. You mutate in a bunch of different directions that suit what not just what individual kids, but what your families, your communities are looking to get. And you have lots more choices and lots more ways to kind of meet the speed and the desires that you have as a parent.
Yeah, I've been really excited lately. I've been visiting some Charlotte Mason inspired hybrid
Hmm.
homeschool programs, one in Pennsylvania, one in Tennessee. Those seem to be growing in popularity too. Charlotte Mason really focused on abundant outside time
Yep.
and play and really child centered. I'm wondering if you're seeing, or are you seeing different sort of flavors or different philosophies emerge within the hybrid homeschool space?
Yeah, so they're all over the place. I would say prior to COVID, there were a lot, the fraction that were religious was a lot higher than it is now. So we get a lot more secular or just different kinds of schools like that. There's a big chunk of the schools that are classical in nature, so sort of, adjacent to Charlotte Mason kind of. Um, that are starting up, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But yeah, the great thing is, I find really interesting versions. I'm sure you see this too. I just find really interesting, unique schools all the time.
Yeah, and I feel like this is a good segue into talking about how you've really been able to connect the dots. And I think you were really one of the first people out of the gate after 2020 to do that. In your book that came out in 2020, you mentioned these various alternative education models. You said, Sudbury, Montessori, Waldorf schools, some
Mhm.
unschooling programs. And you said that they were, quote, fellow travelers with hybrid homeschools. And it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you recognized in 2020 that there was an opportunity to create a big tent of all of these sort of emerging models that had maybe more in common than not, and kind of bring them together. And I think about that inaugural conference in April of 2022, where you didn't know if anybody would show up and you ended up being over capacity within a couple of weeks of registration. And it did bring together, quite a few of these fellow travelers. So what was that like? How did you come to that? Were you sort of intentional about thinking about bringing these travelers together, even though, of course, your program at Kennesaw State focuses on hybrid schools?
Oh yeah. Well, you can come together and there's so many different dimensions to all of these schools, right? So it's not just, hybrid versus micro school, but it's religious versus secular versus, classical or STEM or whatever it is. Um, I think this is one of the really greatest aspects of this whole project that we have going on in this country. Um, People have different desires, and that's interesting to me, right? And I think that the emergence of these kinds of schools is it truly is one of the best ways to kind of bring down the temperature of all the fighting that we have going on in the country lately, right? If you think about different ways that you could get the schools that you want, right? Assuming that you're dissatisfied with a huge conventional school for whatever reason you're dissatisfied with it, right? Well, there's a couple ways you could fix that. You could have um, fights over the curriculum at the state level, right? And maybe you win, maybe you don't, but it's probably not going to stick even if you do win because leadership changes and things like that. Um, and even then, that's kind of like, okay, I wrote a new state curriculum. What does that mean for my local classroom, right? I was a teacher in a just a conventional public school for several years at the start of my career, right? And you interpret things in lots of ways. You have lots of decisions to make every day. So maybe if you can't get the school you want by changing the state curriculum, maybe you run for local school board, and I think that's great too. Um, but that takes a minute, right? It's hard to win that seat. And even if you win one, you might need to win two or three or something like that to get the changes that you want. And that takes a while. And by the time it all gets done, maybe your kids have aged out. You can start a private school or a charter school, right? But there are hurdles with that in terms of getting permissions. Um, Charter schools are constrained by the tests that they have to give and other things. 5-day private schools are worried about the bottom line financially in ways that might constrain them. You might make concessions that you didn't want to. So so starting your own school, like a micro school or a hybrid school, really is a way to get either individual teachers or small local groups to come together and just get the sort of cultural and educational answers that they want without fighting with anybody, right? And you can do that as a classical Catholic school, or as a secular STEM school, or a forest school, or Charlotte Mason, or Sudbury, or whatever. But all of those different flavors of schools are going to face the same kind of regulatory attacks, right? They're all going to face things around their physical space. They're going to face things around the implementation of their curriculum, of the kinds of teachers that they want. And so I think, it's best for everybody. We're all better off to let all that stuff go, right? And just come together at events like we have in Atlanta and talk about, all right, how can we all make each other's schools work? And that's why I love what happens at our conferences. And you're right. The first year, I was afraid that I would be buying lunch for my friends to get them to come the week of the conference. And it turned out we sold out the venue 6 weeks early, and we had to move to a bigger space. So yeah, so that makes me happy too. I'm excited about this.
Yeah. And so at the time of the inaugural conference, were you thinking about these sort of fellow travelers coming together, and how had COVID prompted that?
Yeah, so we had started doing a little bit of kind of exploratory research, and before the conferences happened. So, we do a big national survey every year. And that's one way my work doesn't change, right? I'm still finding these schools and asking them, okay, what's happening? What are you doing? But as we do that, we find lots of different schools, and the questions that they have are all similar, right? Like I just said, if we're worried about, like, okay, can we operate in this kind of building, right? Am I allowed to hire this kind of teacher? And no matter what kind of school you're running, the questions are similar. And so, yeah, I think from the start, we wanted to bring in as many people as we could to kind of answer these questions, and hopefully, make a few new friends along the way, right? I even heard it last year. People who have been doing this work for 5 years or 10 years, and they had no idea that there were people with similar schools, maybe one state over, that they could learn from. And so I think there's a lot of value in coming to meet people in person and talk through some of these things.
Yeah, and it's really been exciting to see the growth of your conference and more of these fellow travelers heading down to Atlanta to join you. I know, we have people who are starting acting academies and the Liberated Learners Network, two
Yep.
of the sort of micro school networks that built up over the first couple of decades of the new millennium, kind of alongside hybrid homeschool programs and
Hmm.
university model programs, and seeing that they're attracted to this. And then this year, you decided to branch out to the West Coast for maybe folks who couldn't make the trek all the way to Atlanta in April to host a program in San Diego. I wonder if you can tell us about that.
Sure. So we've had some long-term supporters out in Southern California who have helped me out with research a lot, and show up in Atlanta. Uh, and I hear from lots of people from lots of different places around the country, we would really like to come. I don't know if we can come. But we have particular issues that we'd like to talk about in whatever region of the country we are. So we thought we'd give it a shot and go out west. I know there are a number of schools out there. California, has their kind of unique homeschooling situation, so they do things a little bit differently out there. Um, but there's a space for us to talk about just what's happening in these particular Western locations, right? Things are a little bit different out there. So we thought we'd go out and just speak to kind of the unique regional stuff that's going on. Um, and this is true of the national conference too, but we get it that these schools, one of the features of all these schools is that they're low budget operations, right? So it's not like you can send people all over the country to these really expensive conferences. So we just try to keep the registration fees to our conference pretty low. Um, but even then, it's maybe helpful to go to where the people are. So we're going to San Diego to talk to a bunch of people who are doing, just like in Atlanta, charter school hybrid and micro schools, classical ones, religious ones. And we're going to talk about things like accountability and sustainability that I think are really pressing out there and everywhere else in the country.
Yeah, it's so great. I'll again put the link to that conference on Saturday, March 2nd, in the
Right.
show notes. Hopefully folks can make it to San Diego for that event. And then the April conference, the national conference in Atlanta coming up shortly thereafter. But yeah, you mentioned California. I mean, California is an interesting place in terms of education innovation and alternative education. They're a state where it's relatively easy to homeschool, relatively easy to start a private school. And it's also a place that you document in your book that had sort of caught on to this hybrid school model or hybrid homeschool model through their charter school system. So really, one of the early secular hybrid homeschool models. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this was an interesting thing to me too, to find that there had been a charter school version going on for 20 years now. And they've expanded to a couple of different places. It's interesting for a lot of reasons. First of all, because they're charter, I don't see why we couldn't have more of these in other places too, right? Other states, people in other states could kind of experiment with this model. I've done a little bit of looking at some of the charter hybrids out there, and they turn out to be, at least at the time, they were actually a little bit more diverse than the school systems that they were sitting in, which was not what I expected to find. Right, you typically don't find that in a lot of these schools. Um, they were more diverse. They were expanding into several different places. And because the nature of the hybrid model is you're home a couple of days a week, so that implies that your third grader's not sitting at home alone all day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? Somebody's got to be there with them. Well, that then implies that you've got the financial ability to make that happen, right? Or you've got the kind of family support around you. So another interesting I found about these charter schools out there is that some of them will just stay open 5 days a week, and maybe they only have formal classes on 2 of them or 3 of them. But then the kids can come in on the off days, and there will be kind of a skeleton crew of teachers to help them work through their homeschool assignments on the days that they're not having formal classes. So I think that's a really unique answer to increase access in these kinds of things, right? That's sort of one of the next frontiers is just how do we get more people in?
Well, how do we get more people in? But this was actually gonna be my next question, because when I visit these hybrid homeschools, they are busting at the seams.
Yeah.
Even if they've just opened within the last year or two, they've doubled their enrollment. Many of them have lengthy waiting lists. It seems like there are so many more families interested in this hybrid homeschool model. Is that what you're seeing too? And I guess, how do we address capacity from that perspective?
Yeah, so there is a lot of demand, right? I mean, our own school has a waiting list in just about every grade. Um, I think part of it is something that we could sort of learn from the charter school sector of 20 years ago, is that we need to build leadership capacity for these things too. A lot of the startup schools tend to be groups of people who come together but don't necessarily have all the training in management and finances and these kinds of things. So we could use some growth in that area. And I know there are organizations out there that are providing like donor development and leadership kind of training. So that's good. Um, yeah, and then we need these networks of schools that are like some of the ones you mentioned. We've got a little group called the Hybrid School Society, just to help coach people up in what to do. How do we start these things? Um, I don't think they're not intended to grow, most of them, to be 2,000 students or 3,000 students. So we need people who are able and willing to take on the challenge of starting up a low cost, high work intensive operation, right? A lot of them are started by teachers too. And teachers who are coming out of the classroom don't necessarily have a lot of these capabilities either. So I think there's room for us to kind of coach up our bench in terms of being entrepreneurs, right? That's really where the supply side needs to grow a little bit.
Yeah, and maybe just letting people know there's a huge opportunity
Yep.
there. So for perspective, education entrepreneurs. There are parents, families that want this model, that are clamoring for it. There are these lengthy wait lists. So jump in and expand more of these
That's right.
programs. And you mentioned accessibility, and you've written about this as well in your book and in your other articles, that one of the appealing factors of these hybrid homeschool programs is they tend to be low cost, significantly lower in cost than traditional private schools in a particular area. So they're already more financially accessible to more families.
Yep.
And then you've written about how they're often in that sweet spot of tuition that's in line with an education savings account or some kind of school choice program that can make these programs even more accessible. I wonder if you can share more about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. The inflation has changed everything, right? But
Mm.
yeah, the typical hybrid school tuition comes in at really close to the numbers that you hear suggested for state level education savings accounts, right? So there's an opportunity there to kind of entirely wipe out the tuition cost for a lot of parents. But that actually leads to another topic that I think might be worth talking about a little bit, which
Yeah.
is how things like accountability get written into these things, right? And so this is something that we're going to talk about in San Diego for sure, and in Atlanta too. But I think it's a conversation that the sector as a whole is having and should have in a much more concrete kind of way, right? So you can say, is because accountability always gets written in some way to these education savings accounts bills, right? And for good reason. You're spending taxpayer money, or you're working with taxpayer funds in some way, directly or indirectly. The question is going to come up, right? So on this idea of accountability, I mean, you could argue, and I think this is true, that just the fact of a parent showing up and presenting their kid is accountability in a sense, right?
Yeah.
They've chosen you over something else, right? And if they de-choose you, that's accountability, right? Um, so the charter school versions of these hybrid schools are subject to kind of state accountability with tests and things like that. Maybe some things like norm reference tests could be more widely used. I don't think it's even possible to come up with some sort of accountability framework that would logically catch even most of these schools, right? So I used to work before I was a professor. I worked in the something called the Office of Student Achievement in Georgia, which was basically the governor's education policy office, and we would do the state report card on all the public schools and preschools and colleges and universities every year. So we would report the data, the accountability data for all the public schools, but there would always be some 10% of the schools that would just look a little bit different. They had some weird program, or they were set up in some kind of unique way. And so 90% of my time would be spent on reporting out these 10% of schools, right? Well, in the hybrid school and micro school sector, they're all the weird versions. Like they're
Yes.
all different from each other, right?
Which is what
So
makes them so great.
that's what makes them so great, right?
Yeah.
And so to kind of try to that just that approach of trying to come up with some kind of matrix or one system to rule them all, I think is not great. However, there are sort of friendly state legislators out there that want to kind of help make things easier for these schools. But as a sector, I think we do need to kind of help them understand and be able to articulate, at least to themselves, why are students better off in these schools than they are at some other big conventional school, right? So that can look a lot of ways. I don't think it can be all anecdotal, right? I think we can do some measures of things like student mental health, or Carrie, maybe you remember, or some of your listeners will have seen this documentary, Most Likely to Succeed, from about 10 years ago, where they talk about this school in Southern California, and they have these big arts and kind of engineering presentations at the end of the semester. So I think this is a conversation that people need to have to be able to help the people who want to help these schools. So what that looks like, I don't know, but that's why I want to talk about it some more.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think that in some ways, and I'd be curious what you think of this too, but compared to a lot of the hybrid homeschool programs that you wrote about in your 2020 book, and now this much kind of larger tent of programs, I think there's even more of that diversity in terms of outcomes, right? Like I think about some of the hybrid schools that you wrote about in your book, they were kind of following a traditional curriculum. They might have had what we think of as traditional metrics of success and academic outcomes. And of course, all these other things like joy and
Yep.
happiness and family involvement and empowerment, all of that. But now, yeah, it seems like it's even more. I mean, I just think about who's coming to your conference and just the ways
Yep.
that they're identifying their own success metrics. So it's an interesting conversation, and I'm glad that you're leading the charge on thinking about it. So I'd love to know, what do you think is the future of hybrid schools, micro schools, this again, big tent of fellow travelers in the alternative education space? Where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, I think it's everything that we've seen for the last 3 years or 5 years, but more, right?
Yeah.
But more. Um, so, but now we're getting into a stage where there is one more thing that I think is going to be interesting to think about, which is um, now that some of these startups have a couple of years on them, what does sustainability look like? And by sustainability, I mean kind of the life cycle of the school, right? So this is a different model. This is not like we plant a school and we expect it to live forever, no matter how poorly it does or how badly it serves its kids, right? Like some other schools we could think of.
Mhm.
So it's a different model, right? It's not meant to be necessarily permanent. But there's we still want, if it's a group of people coming together, you might want the school to live through your kids and then maybe through your grandkids, right? If you're a teacher, maybe you want to start the school and then hand it off to somebody else. Um, I think there's going to be more churn. I don't know that
Mm.
it's great it would not be great if we had schools that popped up one year and closed the next year constantly, and everybody's scrambling every single year. And that happens now for various reasons. So I think we'll see in the next, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, a little bit of equilibrium and kind of maturation in some of these schools. But alongside just the the need to learn about entrepreneurship and the startup stuff, we also need to learn about succession and how to kind of maintain some of these schools that we want to linger for a little bit longer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have the same thoughts that I do, but I just feel like we're at the beginning of this. I think there's going to be
Hmm.
so much more. I was just in Tennessee last week visiting with some micro schools and hybrid homeschool programs, all of which have started since 2020, and the
Hmm.
majority of which have started within the last 18 months. So I think it's just growing, and that's in a state that has a small school choice program, but nothing significant yet. So I'd love to know why you think there's going to be more. Why do you think we're going to continue to see growth? What are some of the factors there?
Yeah, so some of it is um, they're popular. Well, we talked about the waiting lists a little bit. Some of it is think about younger parents, right? So these younger parents who are starting to have kids now, maybe they went to a school like this. They're not gonna. Maybe they went to a school like this, and now they have jobs where they work from home most of the week, right? I think it's not super likely that all of them are going to say, you know what, I'm like going to my office 1 day a week. I only went to school 1 or 2 days a week. I did kind of stuff that interested me. I'm now going to take my kid and put them into a system where they're in classes with bells for 40 hours a week. I think that's less likely as time goes on. So as the new generation comes up, they're going to say, no, we need to, we need more of these schools, right? Um, so I think they'll do that. I think we've got um, the schools that have been around for a while are kind of either handing off their buildings to a new set of people, or they're looking to expand to maybe new places. And then we've only even just barely started with all of the conventional school teachers who are realizing, you know what? I it's not just that I can close my door in my school and do what I want. I can start my own school. We're just at the very beginning of that kind of thing. So I think all of these things together, I mean, we're at the very early stages still, I think.
You're going to need an even bigger conference space then,
Yeah.
Eric,
Yep. Yep.
for bringing all of these folks together. You may have touched on this already, but I'd love to know if you have, what's sort of coming out for you in terms of research. What articles, papers,
Yeah.
books do you expect to be publishing, and what areas related to this movement?
Yeah, we've done several things. We've done this national survey for a few years, and that has been pretty basic in terms of, just where are the schools, how many kids are they serving on average, what are they charging, what does their curriculum look like. There's no national data set for me to pull from for these things. So we're doing a lot of like surveying with that and side projects. But we're starting to be able to get into some more sophisticated sort of things. So we had a paper come out last year on commute times or commute distances, sorry, for hybrid schools. And one of the things we found was that they, in the suburbs, maybe the parents drive a lot farther to get to their schools compared to anybody else, but they drive fewer miles on average, right? So there's lots of implications for that in terms of whatever you want, time in the car, emissions, anything else like that. We're starting to do some work on kind of policy experiments and some more sophisticated stuff with just what do parents actually value in these schools and what do administrators value. Eventually, I'd like to start doing some work with students and hear about kind of their experiences and their thoughts and things like that. So our latest national survey will come out this spring, where we'll have some papers out on kind of these more in-depth surveys about outcomes in the coming year. I edited a book last year on separately on teacher training that I think is useful because it talks about how do we get teachers who are really dialed into a particular education tradition, whether it's Charlotte Mason or just teaching online or classical or whatever. We had Prenda wrote a chapter for that book about how do you get Prenda guides? Where do they come from? So we've got several policy scholars and economists over here working on stuff, but the sky is the limit. It's only determined by how much time we've got on our hands.
Yeah, I can't wait. I think all this research is so important. And as you said, you're really the one generating the data sets because, there isn't sort of a central database at the local, state, or federal levels to kind of track these models. So it's great that you're being able to do that.
Yeah.
So Eric, if my listeners and viewers want to keep track of your incredible research, learn more about the upcoming conferences, learn more about what's going on at the National Hybrid Schools Project, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I'll give you two. Look us up, the National Hybrid Schools Project at Kennesaw State University. You'll find all the information about the conferences, and our work. You can follow us on X, and we'll post things there too.
Wonderful. And I look forward to seeing you in San Diego in a couple of weeks, and hopefully many of my listeners and viewers as well. Eric Wearne, thanks so much for being on the
Th
Liberated podcast.
no, thank you so much, Carrie.